Along the shore, the cloud waves break. The twin suns sink behind the lake. The shadows lengthen in Polis. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies, but stranger still is lost Polis. Songs that the Hyades shall sing, where flap the tatters of the Yellow King, must die unheard in dim Polis. Song of my soul, my voice is dead. Die thou unsung, as tears unshed shall dry and die in lost Polis.
That weird, endless expanse of purple wasteland, where the red sands push through their divided black towers, when all manner of creature spreads itself upon the vast scope of this alien land, that great mass of portentous and tortuous architecture hovers in perfect balance within the gravitational pull of the moon. A horrid place, a place that defies reality, where fantasy wins its game, a place so unknown to our minds, a place not meant to exist, a place of death and work, of waking up in a world with no idea where you are, what you are supposed to do, or what any of it means. There is a sense of dread there, like everything is alive, like everything is watching you, like you are being stalked, its form equilateral. In principle, if not in deed, spun in a steady, languorous motion upon its axis. For each ponderous rotation made, the moon completes another revolution of its own, and so the years pass by. But time is slower on the Devour, initiated by minute oscillations, the deepest of core-shattering pity. The very structure seems to jitter in a manner peculiar in itself. Such vibrations, of varying strength and measure, some light, some not, were most disruptive closer to the center of the monolithic polyhedron, where time itself seems to have taken pause, as if frozen in the very annuals of a winding clock. From beneath the failing light of Datuan, the blessed son of the 10,000 pilgrims, the tomb concludes another cycle. Twisted black towers and rugged twirling spires made from human spines appear from out of the shadows, piercing the blotchy inkiness of space like broken fingers extended against the heavens. Row upon row of jutting buttresses press against the tiered walls, encroaching upon the massive steps that form the levels of the Dar place, this lonely house, this lonely structure, and its broken teeth of black obsidian. Finally, as the shadows withdraw and the faint light of the sun begins to reflect off myriad yellow as brimstone, as powdery as flour, clear-story windows that are warped around the edges in thin ovals, the Dar is revealed in its entirety. The basilica in the void, a pyramidal mausoleum. 1,000 souls once resided within these walls, their lives dedicated to a twofold purpose, life and death, the one fleeting, the other eternal. But now, like so many others, their bodies are interred within the catacombs below. And of those former denizens, only one remains. It is a god-forsaken place, one not of our own world. The landscape of Polis was weird. It was the type of weird that most humans, if spotting it, could not comprehend. It was the type of weird that might make you run your single middle finger down the back of your head. It was the type of weird that put colors to shame. It was the type of weird that probably may not exist. It was the type of weird that reached the very ends of the earth and sat there, primal-like, waiting to be found. As the sun dipped below the horizon on this wasteland, rightly named Polis, casting a blood-red glow across the desolate landscape, standing like guards with granite armor on the precipice of an eerie alien wasteland. The world was a surreal tableau of otherworldly beauty and haunting desolation. The ground beneath was a sickly shade of violet, cracked and barren, as if it had been scorched by the fiery breath of some cosmic dragon. Jagged rock formations jutted out from the ground like the skeletal remains of ancient creatures, their surfaces etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an energy unknown to man. The sky above was a swirling maelstrom of colors. If you cocked your ear and lips in the right angle of the light, the right direction, it would surely blind you. You couldn't even begin to describe deep purples, electric blues, and eerie greens that danced and shifted like the iridescent scales of a giant serpent. Strange, luminous clouds hung low, casting an creepy, ever-shifting light on the landscape below, fat rose-pink in definition and fluffy as if on Earth. In the distance, across these harsh-winded chipped breeze, bizarre flora that defied earthly logic. Towering, twisted trees with indigo leaves rustled in the alien cutter, emitting a haunting melodic hum that sent shivers down one's spine. Vines with bioluminescent tendrils, bright white snow snaked across the ground, pulsating in time with some unseen cosmic rhythm, like filth and intestines weaving its way to make some sort of path. If you ventured further into this surreal wasteland, you might become acutely aware of a silence that was as oppressive as it was eerie. There were no sounds of birds or insects, no rustling leaves or flowing water. That simply did not exist here. It was barren and dry, lifeless and endless. It was as if the very essence of life had been sucked from this place, leaving only a sense of foreboding and unease. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this alien wasteland was the feeling of being watched. The sensation that unseen eyes were following my every move, as if an intruder in a realm whom he did not belong. It was a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred, where the very fabric of the universe seemed to warp and twist. A great expanse of the blowing desert cried out across the skies, stretching for miles until you could see nothing. Polis was a place where souls could be forgotten and men ever more so. Septimus cupped his long, sinewy fingers together and brought the icy water to his face. His fingers were a milky white as light orbs, long, naped, where his bone knuckles could be seen penetrating on the upper ridges of his flesh, a little too long for one natural man. He gasped as tiny, lucent droplets ran down his face and neck, leaving a trail of goose pimples in their wake. His body quickly adjusted to the cold, and he found that wakefulness was less elusive now that this first task was complete. He flicked his hands sharply, once, then twice, then thrice, and reached for the small washcloth beside the basin. The motion was precise, calculated to exactitude, redolent of the meticulous nature of Septimus himself. His face now clean, he turned to the rest of his body. Adjacent to the basin, on the opposite side to the washcloth, sat two grey bowls, as grey as stone. In the one, a blend of finely ground ochre and white powder that smelled sweet as sugar. In the other, a crimson paste that stank like rawhide of a dying beast. Septimus pinched a long index finger and thumb together and dragged them through the powder, leaving a furrowed channel behind that resembled something like a rope being dragged across sparse sands. He rubbed his digits together, spreading the fine dust across his leathery hands, and carefully applied the mixture to each of his cheeks that were as pale as the moon, maybe even paler. Next, Septimus swirled a pinky through the white water and dabbed it in the second bowl. Satisfied that the dilution was acceptable, he lifted his finger to his brow and drew it down from the center of his forehead, past his pursed pink lips, to the cleft of his chin. He licked his lips, careful not to smear the paste beyond the ridge of his mouth, and tasted the bitter paint on his tongue. It did taste bitter, a little too bitter for his liking, as if he had licked a growing mold alongside the black facets of these walls in which he stood. Finally, Septimus drew his stained white robes from the ground. He dusted down the yawning sleeves, tightened the belt around his waist, and adjusted his hood. He was now ready to perform his duties. There was something odd about Septimus, something strange, something inhuman, something not quite right in his figure and posture. Well, his posture was quaint and sturdy. He had a straight back and an even straighter neck. But he was skinny, very skinny to where his body was loose and gainly. His most striking feature is the ethereal, almost translucent, pale skin that shimmers like moonlight on water. It appears to be a delicate porcelain canvas, adorned with intricate, luminescent patterns that change color with his emotions. Crimson red when angry, a bright copper when confused, a emerald green when joyous, a flush pink if odd romantic feelings arise, which was rare, mind you, for Septimus's, a light blue when swept with melancholy, or a dark, dark midnight black with fear nibbles his ribcage, making every encounter a kaleidoscope of wonder. But his skin was almost always white, barely changed color, unless in the rarest of situation. These patterns are a form of natural communication among the Luminaeon people, capable of conveying complex feelings and intentions. His facial features are an enigmatic blend of human and bone. With possessed large expressive eyes with irises that shift between shades of lavender, silver and black. These eyes are framed by long, elegant lashes, which, when they blink, produce a soft, melodic chime. His hair was quite natural, if you think having fibers jiggle when laughing is natural, which seems to be a fusion of human hair and bioluminescent pricks, cascading down his back like a waterfall of liquid starlight. His physique was tall and slender, with limbs that appear almost weightless, and fingers that end in gracefully elongated digits, resembling delicate tendrils. His hands was his most prized feature, an extraordinary sensitivity to touch, allowing them to perceive the slightest vibrations in the environment, making them exceptional keepers. His feet were barefoot and white as the cloth of his robes, and they stepped strangely, like they were growing before his long legs, and his walk was full of confidence, but also with a little bit of tire dabbed inside. He stretched his bony ribcage, cracking unto itself, to dot his sides like a torn-apart barrel. Septimus had been a curator on the Polis for an imprecise period of time. In some parts where infinitesimal vibrations had shifted the very fabric of reality and time had slowed down to a faltering pace, Septimus had only just accepted his post. In others, the cold hand of centuries had waved itself none too gently, and the curator had been dead for a long, long time. Such contradictions are commonplace in the vast burial ground of which he was custodian, though he was careful not to dwell on them too often. To do so would be unwise, and Septimus was anything but that. The curator blinked myopically at the door to his cell, then peeled back one of his sleeves and flashed the tendril that wrapped around his pale arm like a vice, oozy and black, embedded in his wrist. With a mechanical whir and the hiss of pneumatics, the door slid open, adding a fleshy, squishy sound. Septimus pulled at the hem of his robe, clutching handfuls of the material between his gnarled fingers, and stepped out into the passageway beyond. Stark, strong light blared down from the fluorescence above, and the soft humming of rotary machines filled the air around him. In the bowels of the Polis, where there was no need for spectacle or ceremony, The walls were dreary and unadorned. Grey fibercrete tiles blended with ever-rusting sheathed black metals and sparse, windowless walls. The space was narrow, with only enough room for one person to walk comfortably. Not that he needed more. His former colleagues were long dead, their corpses sealed within the chilly niches of the main crypt. He'd put most of them there himself. The thing on his arm was made completely of a rustic oak wood that was physically burned into his skin, as if seared there by a poker. It was sharp, pointy and thin, extending from the two top fingers of his middle and index before retracting back inside of him to never been seen again. It was 1 foot in length. When erupted, it made a quick, jarring air sound like trying to cut it in half. Humid air rushed through the corridor, and the slow creak of metal whined in a syncopated rhythm from above. Finally, with a grating thump that echoed along the walls, the tedious song came to a halt, and the sealed door opened. Septimus entered the lift and thumbed a sequence of digits into the interface beside the door. It was an interface made out of human blood and flesh. It was a great panel, easy access, rough red and soft when touched, that controlled these lifts through this place, shaped as if the shin bones were hammered together, circular in nature and pulled on wires. A luminous green light shone in acceptance. The squeaks of blood gurgling resounded, and the steel cage took off, racing toward its destination above. The Curator slid his fingers through the barred frame of the lift as it screeched and rattled, holding tight when the shaking steel floor threatened to throw him from his feet. The amber light flickered once, and then went off entirely, leaving the Curator in a darkness so thick he could almost feel it pressed against his skin. The lift itself began to falter, slowing in speed as the mechanism within shut down. It was running on fumes at this stage. The whole tomb was. The Curator felt around with a hand, his fingers extended out toward the dark, until he felt the cold face of the walls. He muttered a few words and pressed his palm squarely against the bone-glass face. His murmured incantation was met by a high-pitched wheeze from the roof of the cage as the bulbs sputtered back on. This was followed by the reassuring drone of the lift's mechanism, and everything returned to order. Septimus let out a relieved sigh. He'd have to see to that. The cage traveled him past many exquisite places before his destination. Welcome to How the Sausage is Made. The sausage meat in question belongs to a group of pitiful humanoid creatures that can join themselves together. The factory level, referred to internally as the assembly, would be established to harvest their bodies on an industrial scale. Everything from these creatures' birth and their transport to their slaughter and hints at how different body parts are stripped and put to use had to be planned. It was a wicked place. Execution machines and circular saw grinders purposefully creating machinery with precision-planned functions for operating their seeds as they seek to find a way out of the factory. Transport carts rattling along spine-like single rail tracks and simple articulated body hooks give the assembly's production line an arid retro-industrial feel, contrasting with the positively greenhouse-esque growing labs. The fetid light of glowing red pods containing humanoid figures nestled inside biomechanical tulips. Petals splayed open to reveal the inner shielding structures blinded Septimus, and he was forced to raise his frail arm to block his eyes from the glare, his robes shifting along his elbow. Podhouse ceilings are smeared with thick amniotic fluid, rivulets coursing down the walls. Flying drones busily tend to parasite rooms, misting the atmosphere to hydrate the monolithic tissue towers found beneath the branches of a sinister giblet tree. Septimus knew this place was the haven where bodies were constructed and sold for their parts. Fittingly, the factory itself appears woven from recycled bodies, making it feel like a living place all of its own. In a horrific ode to the concept of wallpaper, it reveals hallways flanked with hanging tapestries of stretched skin. The building's windows eschew glass for taut layers of organ membrane, with surrounding frames and consoles made from polished and reassembled bone. If any living beings built this place, they were surely osteologists, not architects, Septimus thought. At the center of it all sits the factory's literal heart. Outwardly, it appears to be more a refinery than an organ. diseased atria and ventricles wrapped in a chaotic tangle of mechanical arteries designed, in part, to pump fear and distilled cruelty around the factory's many capillary hallways in the keepers. When someone might venture inside, its true nature is revealed. The heart doubles as a junction of walkways, granting access to the factory's different levels from one central point. Septimus usually had to go there too, report his list of cucumbing the dead. But today was not that day, not today. But Septimus didn't really know what day it actually was. He had been doing this profession for so long, it simply had lost its breath to him. The second layer appeared out of misty gas before him, as the crate racketed on high in the air along its lines through the wan dark. The second layer was the scariest part to him. It sent shivers down his spine and rose the goose flesh and hairs along his scalp and forearms. He tried to refuse to gaze upon its elegance simply. He even forcibly turned his whole tall body away, facing the other side of the glass. But still, it whispered to him. It called to him. It beckoned him on some great lateral scale, as if an invisible thread was inching him to walk those parts again. He shivered once more. Cold air brushed his upper pale back, the place where he was birthed, where he was spat out of its womb-intoned coffin. The wall. The tallest place in all of Polis, reaching to an ungodly height as if to pierce the cloudy sky. He slightly cocked his head to look at it, flitting his eyes and pupils to the corners of his face. He caught a quick glimpse. Built not with bricks and mortar, but from flesh, organs, and uterine lining, here stands the answer to the question of where, if life flourishes. The universe's humanoid creations are neither born from a creature or assembled in a lab, but birthed from ruptures on the side of an unnatural embankment. It was the miracle of creation in this realm, which begins with humanoids gestating at random spots within the wall's central chamber. When they reach certain sizes, their backs begin to press against the lining, causing it to swell outwards and cradle the growing bulks like pregnant bellies or cocoons. Once the dry epidermal film reaches its breaking point, the cocoon's outer shell cracks and then splinters. For many newborns, Septimus knew, released from the shackles of their cocoon, death awaits. It was cruel fate. Gravity sends them crashing to the floor far below. This randomness underscores the futility of most life, arbitrarily taken away from creatures after just seconds through no fault of their own. In one chilling swish, rows of decomposing forms lay beneath their gaping cocoons, carcasses fatally shattered by the drop and subsequent impact, bones lying across the ground. Septimus shivered yet again. He was one of the lucky ones. He had survived the fall from the wall before becoming a keeper of this horrid place, barely coming away with so much as a light bruise and a cut cord across his belly and his temple. But others had not been so graced with the ability of living. He flashed his eyes once more at it, the grey wall and blood dripping, that stretched wide and far upon this desert where long, juicy spleens sagged out of their black holes. He even thought, no, certainly not. Could he see a similar figure to his own yanking desperately at the tidal of his intestines, trying to break free? It was a harsh thing. He could even hear the muffled grunts of it. He clamped his eyes shut tight, trying to ignore the sounds. The cold winds would crush its body to nothing if he did not stumble to the field first, or he would be a goner. No one has ever climbed that wall, and certainly Septimus knew of this. You would not make it to the top. He doesn't even know when it was built or how long it had been there. He was only 2007 years old anyhow, barely a young man. The third place the crate took him was somewhat more peaceful, but no less grotesque. The field. The wide expanse of pods saturated with moaning desert dunes, like it was a mimicry of a sunlit grassy meadow that has been scorched. A nourishment, yes, that was what this place reminded Septimus of, a place of nourish. Wind-whipped sandbeds and seemingly endless stretches of dry nothingness contribute to a hard-scrabble environment that feels impossible to traverse without aid. Scuttled ship-like features tell tales of devices abandoned to a zone where you are meant to survive. It's a doomsday vision of an entire world exsanguinate. Bare vents, hundreds of them, raptured across this place, mouths agape like a face of someone had their gums wielded open with a pair of tongs. There are hints of animal graveyards too. a behemathic rhinoceros corpse, its tusks and humped hide first baked in choking heat, then lacerated by the elements. Human skeletons lay terrible buried in sands. Horse skulls poked their snouts from corners. God, what had we done to make this place fall to such ruin? Did we fail in our minds to create a paradise? Yet like stubborn cacti sprouting out from the driest sand dunes on Earth, or microbes defying all odds and thriving inside active volcanoes, here life also finds a way. Those gravestone-like vents unintentionally double as canals, as corrupted tendrils of flesh chase, expelled exhaust fumes from underground lairs and into the open, teasing the horrors that lurk below for anyone who dares cross the threshold. He remembered his long walk across the field to where he does his work, when his bare foot ached and his toes crunched against his ankle, the dark sands meshing and mixing between his flesh, where he walked for hours, stumbling on his knees to the tall tower of Polis for solitude and comfort. What a godless place, a nightmarish domain. Thankfully, the final place before he reached his stop before the tower was the crater. From the perspective of this desolate, unprotected surface of the field, the location nicknamed the crater looks heavenly. A giant cylinder bored vertically into the ground like a storm pool, promising warmth, refuge from exposure, and a moment of respite from whatever prowls through the fog above. Who could possibly have predicted that it would soon reveal itself to be a perilous descent into horrors untold? A plunging central drop of stomach-churning depth, criss-crossed with suspended walkways. The crater's outer walls are woven with hallways. Egg-sac-shaped windows are spread throughout the structure, pockmarking the circumference at heights of pleasing irregularity. The source of this location's malignancy comes in the distended shape of a resident queen monster. She sits at the base of the pit and churns out young at machine gun pace to transform the potential shelter into a near, inescapable feeding pit. Crawling blood vines entrapped the walls like smoke, and the smell of rancid meat and decay was beyond explanation. The brood strong enough to tear free from their siblings spend their first moments of life dragging themselves up to these windows and shuffling through to infest other regions. Like ants taking over your house. If so, they're ants by way of snails, leaving trails of organic residue to infect every surface. The aforementioned blighted surfaces are designed with extraordinary detail for a place like this. Chitinous columns buttress the curved walls like the legs of cyclopean locusts, bird tibia angled to offer no purchase for would-be boulderers seeking escape, and sharpened tongues plunge deep into the standing fluid. Larger viewing portals bulge from the surfaces like elongated boils, bordered by arterial tubes and sliced open across the middle to allow unrestricted views across the chasm. He hated this place, where bone machines extracted tissue from bodies and skeletons, sucked souls for the taking for longer age span, stairwells and endless hallways to get lost in, where the flooring is hard wood and the ceiling is narrow and slanted, where terrifying creatures run amok remotely, the little bird-like winged beasts squawk in the corridors, and deserts, four-legged beasts with no ears and an acute sense of smell, to gobble you up once spotted, not to mention they are as fast as a rabbit. Septimus hated this place even more. No wonder no one travels there anymore. It was abandoned long ago, but still sits, waiting. The lift took him to one of many landing stages within the center of the tower, deep in the city of Polis. This one filtered out to a passage not unlike the one before his cell, and he strode toward the door with purpose once he'd disembarked. The realm called Polis is a place of aspiration. As the crate slowed to a creak, roiling fog and skies, the color of mustard gas only served to further reduce visibility and heighten panic, pushing the crate into inconceivably close quarters, as if before a butchery can began. Of gleaming citadels and ornate murals, an abundance of vertical lines and triangular shapes borrowed from Gothic architecture gives Polis and its structures a sacral feeling, far removed from the wet grime and gristle explored during his journey. The murals, the artistic explorations of death's power so prevalent in the Middle Ages of Aragon. These paintings depict scenes where four-armed skeletal figures unzip the skin of humans and grope at the organs within. A chilling reminder. Mutilated bodies lay splayed open mid-vivisection upon these grey walls, while other characters are gagged or outright impaled by tubing and pipework. There's an abundance of sex depicted too, and not just confined to the murals themselves, but in erotic postures and positions. Polis was the city of the dead, the city of soul-seeking. It stretched with its black towers, spirals and etched symbols, a congealed body of buildings and structures as if warped together with sharp sickled edges and wide stone roads, reaching into the purpley sky like a wart on your eyeball, always in view from whoever or wherever you come from in this place. Its was overflowing with decorative sculptures of copulating corpses posed in different positions, their bodies clearly in states of decomposition as they engage in a range of sexual activities. Sketches of shadowy walkways located far beneath the gleaming citadel's heights, confusing tangles of kinked passages with frequent elevation changes, jumbled together to make for journeys as daunting as possible. In this civilization, they worship the consciousness and its physical form, a god to be beggared and pleaded to. He strode up the walking landing to a closed door. It opened without the need of his wood finger pointer, and he pushed past it into an oblong chamber. The room contained dozens of wall-mounted shelves, each holding hundreds of dusty, leather-bound tomes and books of old. There were many rooms like this scattered throughout the Polis, and the Curator spent much of his time digitizing their contents. It was the toil of lifetimes, but Septimus was nearly done. He breezed through the room, barely glancing at his most recent work pile, and exited through a door on the other side. He had other duties to fulfill that day. Before Septimus, a large cavernous hall materialized, annular in nature. Rows of concentric rings rose up around a gaudy black spire in the center of the room. In each of the concrete layers surrounding the steeple, hundreds or more niches had been formed. Carved out with the use of hydrocentric drilling, the holes gave the chamber the appearance of one colossal honeycomb. Tiered steps mounted the area before the central tower, and 4 pillars stood steady and strong beside it, like those of a temple. But this was no place of worship. Every opening that pinpricked the outer rings was garlanded with a decorative crest and inscription, as well as a simple polyolithic mound that rested before them. And within this blasted labyrinth, a dominating pillar of pipes and ladders, with a base encircled by a curving slug of a structure. The tower's a sickly orange-brown that blends into the reddened clouds behind it. A sloping dirt pathway rising towards a sheathed entranceway makes for an imposing walk, but the tower's most striking external features by far are 2 thick elevated tubes attached to pods high up the tower's shaft, trailing off to the side towards parts unknown like slackened telegraph wires. Their purpose? To carry off endless torrents of meat. But Septimus knew this. He had done it 1,000 times before. In each of the alcoves, a single body lay entombed, for this was a place of the dead. The largest of all the chambers in the Polis, the ossuary was lit by the cold light of a dozen floating lamps. They hovered like the bees of a hive, zipping from one vault to another at dizzying speed, buffeting each other in their eagerness to illuminate the darkest corners of the chamber. Hundreds of keepers had once looked after the souls resting here, monitoring each of the interred like an obsessive mother would a child, but now it was only him. He strode into the gallery, making for a recess in the furthest corner of the ossuary. Flights of stairs rose beside him, following the curving walls of the chamber ever upward. More resting places awaited him above, spiraling up into the darkness, where even the ambitious little lamps struggled to reach. The alcove in question was some distance away, so he lifted the hem of his robes and increased his stride. The soft click-clack of his naked feet upon the tiled floor was the only sound in the echoing chamber, and he quickly fell into a steady rhythm. When he arrived at the niche, a sheen of perspiration had formed on his brow, and the red paste he'd so fastidiously applied that morning was threatening to smudge. He dabbed gently at the sweat, careful not to disturb his earlier efforts, and wiped both his hands upon his robes when he was done. He could not move to the next task if the labors of his previous became undone. Such a thing would be heretical. Septimus knelt, lowering his knees one at a time in a staggered sequence of movements, and came to a rest in front of the mound. From his robes he drew a tangled string of beads that he wrapped around a knuckled hand. They felt dry and uneven against his skin, chipped and worn by time, but comforting nevertheless. Carved from the bone of one of his precursors and coupled with the black stone of the ossuary, the prayer beads were as sacred as the place itself. He steepled his fingers and rested his palms on his chest. The beads hung low, hovering in front of his midriff, swinging gently with each breath like a slow-moving pendulum. Next, he lowered his head and closed his eyes. He held this position, his lips moving soundlessly, until his knees began to ache beneath him. As if prompted by some unheard command, Septimus rose to his feet and stepped past the mound and into the alcove itself. The niche was shallow, hardly a couple of feet cut out from the grey rock, and Septimus found himself pressed tightly from all sides against the shelf in the center of the recess. The teeth from the drill that had formed the narrow inlet had left great furrows in the walls, akin to erosive watermarks left by the ocean's tides. The curator stared around him, basking in the dim light of the closest lantern as he read the walls. More than a dozen shapes had been carved into the face of the stone, a complex weave of iconography and glyphs. The inscriptions commemorated the life of the figure laid bundled up on the ledge. By all accounts, it had been an impressive life. Born from the wall, tamed creatures of the sands rose to even be a leader in the hierarchy of Polis. Septimus pressed a hand against the mantle, pushing a finger into a hidden compartment beneath. Feeling the flat sheeting of the screen, he swiped his thumb over the surface and stood back from the shelf as a ripple of neurthatic energy emanated from within the room. It brushed gently against the curator's skin and robes, wrapping itself around him. He shivered for a moment, feeling the cold energy coil its way beneath his flesh and wriggle inside of him. And then it was gone. Whatever last reservoir of life remained in that room had now departed, flickering out like the light of a candle. Septimus tilted his head, staring down at the empty corpse lying flat on the table. It was only the strongest of souls that lingered after death. 1 in a million, perhaps. Whoever this was must have been very impressive indeed. The curator sighed deeply to himself and began the administrations. Septimus knew that when his time came, he would not find himself interred within the Polis. He would not be afforded the great honor of the eternal rest. He wanted something different than the rest. No, his was a life of service, of hardship. His body would be incinerated like those who held the post before him, and his soul offered up to the silent Yellow King so that it may aid in the continuation of the great work. Be as it may, Septimus did not have many ambitions or many thoughts of his own. Day by day in the starlight he would tend to the dead. He would die lonely and bereft, not remembered for his great duty. What a pondering sham it was, to be denied such rights in his life, forced to take life and soul from these lived people. It, however, did make him sad. His skin bristled a light blue along his arms and legs, even his neck, which was long and thin. Damn it! God damn it! This was his life, his sacrifice for the greater good, his endless struggle. Why would anyone give a fat farthing about a lonely old keeper? Surely nobody would. Tears almost wiggled from his strange eyes at these thoughts. Who would miss an old keeper? No one. It was the way of things here. Even in death, he would not have a purpose. The curator placed a hand upon the cold, hard skin of the deceased. His touch was gentle, and he took care not to bruise the flesh where he pressed against it. First, he pressed his thumb and forefinger against the corpse's chin. Then, he pressed his hands against the man's cheeks, squeezing softly in a circular massage-like motion. He continued this process, moving down toward the man's throat and neck. He felt the legs, arms, toes, and fingers, even the head and abdomen. Finally, he rested his palm against the man's chest and began the final incantation. A faint blue light evaporated from the dead man's mouth. When he was done, he stood motionless and stared down at the body. The corpse was now an empty vessel, completely bereft of even the memory of the life force that had once powered it. Septimus nodded to himself, satisfied that his duty to the dead had been completed, and pressed the screen beneath the mantle. The mechanism whined for a moment, and then purred contentedly as it began lowering the corpse into the floor. The curator stepped toward the opening, but glanced back before leaving. He watched as the body was slowly lowered, as the steel slide began to close across the tomb below. Here the dead would rest, in the peace and quiet, in the absolute darkness of eternity. Septimus envied him for that. Why can't I be remembered? When next the keeper emerged from his cell, he was notified of another presence aboard the Polis. It was a single heat signature, confined to a landing bay far above the labyrinthine corridors he inhabited. Setting aside his duties for a moment, he took a lift to the highest floor and traveled at the tip of one of the tomb's great spires. The way here was empty, and it was seldom that he found himself traversing the narrow bridges beneath the silver dome. Legends say there were moldmen like white-skinned beings that used to roam these halls before the Great War, cataclysmic fighting that shook and quacked the very foundations of this planet. When man and beast pitted against one another, hand in hand, weathery old guns and devastating machine. Warped flesh took over like a sickness here, for power and existential sight to gain. Before that war, taking place in history nearly 6,000 years ago, this place was a cauldron of life, of bustling cities and towns, of lush forests and wreathed with glowing, happy humanity. Now it has died. Now it has fallen. The landing platform was rarely used. It had been rarely used when the vessel was a densely populated place too, but now it seemed decades would pass between each visitor. Not that Septimus minded. He had always preferred the solitude of his own company to that of others. The dome itself was a translucent screen. Beyond it, the white light of distant suns twinkled defiantly against the black vastness of space. The tomb was in the middle of one of its leisurely rotations, and the dome spire faced away from the crater-riddled moon below. Instead, its steepled towers stared unblinkingly into the empty black, at long dead stars and the blotchy stain of the Hubris constellation, spattered in 100 rainbow colors. He'd come here often as a novitiate and pondered his own fate, and of those entombed beneath the heavens. Such visits had become less frequent over the years, until they had stopped altogether. Why was that? He wondered briefly, as he came at least to a heavy door. He shook free the thought and swiped his hand. The wood staff that had been with him since birth ejected from his fingers, a bell of tolling, a friend at least, to keep his company in the dimmest hour. After a brief pause, the door opened, and Septimus stepped inside. The heat signature had been registered here, the building's automated systems picking up the interloper the moment he or she had set foot aboard. Septimus stared about the landing post, looking for the telltale signs of a vessel that had just completed atmospheric diffusion. About a dozen drones were still docked in the bays, though their occupants would no longer require their services. The curator hesitated beside one of the raptor-like radius vessels, but the marks were old, the paint chipped and rugged from use in years gone by. He ran a hand over the worn-down steel and concrete of the ship's corrugated exhaust and wondered at the places this transporter must have seen. Could he travel there too? Leave this place? No, surely not. This was his place, his home, the place that gave him life. A sound to his left, the soft click of boots on marble, made him turn. So young, he thought as he appraised the new arrival. A girl, no more than 5 or 6, stood before him. She had wispy brown hair that hung across her eyes and full, round cheeks. She wore the grey robes of a novitiate, which hung from her 2 small limbs. The girl wrinkled her nose up at him, and Septimus found himself quite unsure of what to do. He had never been given a child before, only men and women. Her face was plump and cherry, rosy cheeks, the shining, everlasting glow of cuteness. His pale skin bristled again into an orange confusion. Eventually, after an awkward silence, Septimus gathered himself and approached the child, extending a hand toward her, his long fingers almost touching her small wrist.
Hello.
Hello.
This is no place for one such as yourself,
he said. He clasped her little hand with his own and began to walk back toward the lift. It was warm, soft, not cold like his.
What is your name?
He inquired as they strode across the arching bridges, through the narrow chambers of the boarding platforms.
Shima.
She seemed unafraid of her surrounds, confident in a way only a child could be.
Who are you?
Me?
He smiled despite himself. No one has ever bothered to care to ask for his name.
I am the keeper of this place, but you may call me by my name, Septimus.
Septimus.
She stumbled over the words, her glinting blue eyes narrowing as she confronted the consonantal sound.
No.
He bent on his long legs to level his face with hers, lingering a long finger at her face.
Sepper.
Sep.
Tai.
Tai.
Moose.
Moose.
Septimus.
Septimus.
That's right.
He said, nodding encouragingly. He could not remember the last time he had conversed with anyone, let alone a child. It was like talking with stone on your gums. He glanced at her, a grey brow raised. Shima was dragging her feet through her long robes. He'd have to hem them in for her, and was now chewing quite happily on one of her nails. The caretaker ushered her across the last bridge and spared a final look up at the dome. He felt very small beneath the countless stars, pinpricks of light, and smaller still in the face of the impossible void. The hazy band of light in the distance provided some comfort, though. The Hubris constellation, the realm of the silent Yellow King. Someday soon he would join him there and continue unhindered by the shackles his mortal form provided. A wave field flickered somewhere overhead, spreading blue light across the bulbous screen that encased the upper spire and obstructed his view. Septimus sighed to himself and nodded Shima forward toward the lift. She wasn't what he'd expected, but she'd have to do.
What day is it?
She asked all of a sudden as they approached the lift. Septimus's skin swashed into orange again.
What day is it?
Nodded the little girl in a giggly, high-pitched voice. Septimus looked up into the dark sky above them. His eyes moved across the stars, reading them, deciphering their meaning and their stories, what they held, judging the time by the movement of the Hubris. When the constellation was high into the sky, it was somewhere between 2 moons to 6 moons, when in the middle, 12 to 5, and low, 10 to 1. He cocked his head to her, his long hair swaying as he did so.
Do you mean what time it is?
Shima thought for a moment, fingering her chubby chin.
No, what day is it?
Septimus looked back up into the sky and the stars.
I do not know.
They continued to walk back to the chambers, the little girl skipping behind his robes like a prancing pony, peppering him with questions.
What is the year then?
I do not know.
What is the time then?
I do not know.
What is your last name?
I do not have a last name.
But everybody has a last name. Mine's Shy. Shima Shy.
That is a very fond name then.
It is. My mother named me after the 13th moon rise.
Is that so?
Is it so? Do you live here?
Yes,
Why do you live here?
because I have too.
That doesn't make any sense. That's silly. Just because you live here does not mean you're trapped.
Well, I am.
The girl wrinkled her nose in confusion.
That's stupid. That's so dumb. You could travel anywhere. Where would you want to go then?
Septimus craned his head and scowled down at her. She beamed her big wet eyes up at him, completely innocent. He had never been asked that question before. Where would he want to go? In truth, he didn't know where. Perhaps to the 2nd moon, where the terrain is more beautiful and free, he shrugged.
I do not know.
Do you have a family?
No.
That's sad.
It was sad.
Everyone has a family.
Well, not me.
So how old are you?
2007.
No way.
Yes.
That's so old.
Not at all.
Do you like your job?
He ignored that question. The girl skirted to yet another one.
Do you have a favorite star in the sky?
She pointed up as they walked. Septimus flicked his eyes upwards for a moment, then back ahead to the cramped hallway they were traversing.
Perhaps.
Well, which one?
Orion's.
That one is pretty. It's shaped like a spoon. Mine is lion.
Interesting.
I know. I read books, you see. Do you like to read books?
I read scrolls.
What kind of scrolls?
Scrolls.
The little girl rolled her eyes.
That's very vague. I mean, what do you do with the scrolls, Septi?
He scowled at her again and she glittered a smile.
Do not call me Septi.
His pale skin bristled into a deep crimson red. Annoyance and anger.
Fine, fine. Do you like to write?
Sometimes.
Me too. I find it most relaxing. Do you like to eat? What is your favourite food?
Colca berries.
Colca berries? What's that? I've never heard of those.
They're berries.
What colour are they?
Violet.
Are they sour?
No.
Are they sweet?
Yes.
Okay, so Septimus likes berries.
Yes.
Where do they grow?
In water.
How's that? When I came on the ship there was no water I could see, just sand.
Magic.
Really?
No.
Then how do they grow?
Septimus sighed.
Silver water is the water we drink here. It is iridescent and glows within the light of the moon. It makes the berry stems in the sand beds sparkle and sprout due to phoserchence. It's a nightshade. We collect water from the droplets of stardust.
What does iridescent mean?
To shimmer.
Like in light?
Yes.
They turned right down the grey hallway and descended a flight of narrow steps, her head bobbing behind him.
Do you like jokes?
No.
Why not?
Because they are a distraction.
No, they're not.
Yes, they are.
Want to hear a joke?
No.
It's a really good one.
I think not.
Please.
No.
Pretty double, please.
I said no.
What are you?
What do you mean?
I mean, what are you? It's a question, Mr. Man. Like, what type of people are you?
Lemueans.
What's that?
We are the rulers of death.
That doesn't sound fun.
It can be.
His voice was monotone there.
What can you do?
We came from the stars and the moon.
Like we're born from it?
Yes.
How?
I do not know.
Why does your pale skin change colour?
It just does. When we feel a certain emotion.
That's interesting. How does it work?
It just works.
Where do you sleep?
In a cell.
Is it cold?
Yes.
Is there a bed?
No.
Are there blankets?
No.
That sounds boring.
Septimus did not respond to that.
Can you tell the time by the stars?
Yes.
How does that work?
Magic.
Really?
Shima's voice squeaked and her eyes filled with bright wonder.
No.
What do you do for fun?
Nothing.
Why not?
I do not know.
So you rummage around all day?
Perhaps.
Shima soured her lip at that.
I like stars. They're all bright and pretty in the purple sky.
She randomly said. A typical child, endless questions and endless annoyance.
They are.
Where are you from?
Here.
Okay, so we got here. Be specific. Where?
Here.
Come on now, Septimus.
The girl checked herself before calling him that funny little nickname again.
Where are you from?
A desert.
Is it a big desert?
Yes.
Are there sand dunes?
Yes.
Are there rocks?
Yes.
Are there plants?
No.
Where I come from, we have loads of grass, trees, lakes, caves and fields. It's pretty enchanting there. We even have houses made of hard wood built by a big river.
Septimus nodded. He thought of that tortured field before and shivered.
Are there houses?
No.
Are there trees?
Sort of.
Do you think yourself intelligent?
That almost stopped Septimus dead in his tracks. He furrowed his brow, his skin creasing to orange.
Why, yes. I do very much.
Are there people?
Somewhat.
Well, what does that mean?
It means what it means.
You're no fun, Septimus.
And you have a lot of questions.
I do.
I know.
Yes.
She pointed to his pale wrist.
Why do you have a wood thing in your arm?
I just do.
But why?
It was given to me.
By whom?
By the wall.
What's the wall?
A wall.
What is this place?
Polis.
What's Polis?
A city.
Well, I could tell it was a city by the towers, silly. Why is it called Polis?
It just is.
Who named it?
The Silent Yellow King.
Who is that?
He rules this planet.
Is he a good king?
Septimus kept quiet again.
I'll take that as a maybe. So Septimus rummages around all day doing nothing. He does not like jokes. He eats violet berries. He reads scrolls. And is from the big desert. You're 2007 years old and you hate jokes.
You are astute.
I know.
Yes.
Who built it?
The 10 gods.
Oh, the 10 gods who came from comets and stars. What were their names?
Alaric, Bazar, Fur, Zigyak, Dura,
I know their names, silly. I was just testing to see if you did.
Septimus frowned at that.
When was it built?
1,000,000 years ago.
What do you do?
For work,
Yes?
I am the Curator.
What is that?
A keeper.
What is a keeper?
A man who looks after people when they have passed.
That's scary.
Not really.
Yes, it is. Who would want to be alone forever and look after bodies?
Septimus froze with his steady pace, shimmer nearly bumping into his straight back. He felt tears prick his eyes, welling up inside. His skin formed into that light blue again. Shima narrowed her eyes at him, scanning for any sign that perhaps she had said something to prick his nerves. Septimus frowned, rubbing his temple, wiping the few tears from his eyes, and moving on. The girl, now suddenly realizing what she had said, must have evoked a sense of sadness within him, stopped asking questions and sullenly trailed behind him. Over the next hour, Septimus familiarized the girl with her various roles and duties upon the Polis. She was a quick learner and took to her tasks with ease. He found himself impressed with her enthusiasm and with the knowledge she'd already accrued on the topics he instructed on. Apprentices he'd had in the past had proven unsuited to the task.
Thread slowly and be careful not to poke yourself.
The Curator gently pressed the strand through the canvas and watched to see her mirror the task.
Wounds made with an ethertic blade are not prone to healing.
But these are needles.
He nodded, a thin smile on his lips.
The principle remains the same. It is the substance of the tool that counts, not the name. That this is an ethertic needle and not a blade is of no consequence. The result will be the same.
What is ethertic?
She asked, thumbing the sharp tip of the needle. Septimus nodded, offering his pale hand out to take the long needle. Shima hesitated, but reluctantly gave it to him, forcing the hilt of it first, as to not cut his precious frail skin. Septimus took the needle by the middle part, running it through both hands with such ease, it is as if he had done it 70 times.
Ethertic is a type of needle that can pierce any skin, even bone. If cut upon this blade,
he pointed a long finger at Shima's polished right arm.
Your tan skin, it would fester with poison. Only the fabric can absorb such a thing. It was forged by the Great Queen during her reign.
Shima frowned, shivering a little, but Septimus could not tell if it was from fear or from how cold the room had gotten. A prickly cold. Honestly, Septimus did not know much of emotion. He handed the needle back to her reaching her hand out and clasping her tiny fingers around the frame of it with a ting. She brought it up to her face, moving the point upwards past a stray lock of brown hair that had tumbled to her eye, examining it.
Are you lonely?
she asked randomly, tapping the needle. Septimus took a long moment of pause to answer.
Sometimes.
Why?
She asked curiously.
Does it make you sad?
That stopped Septimus's in his cold heart. It was like his heart had ceased to erupt and thump. Sometimes, do I get lonely sometimes? Combing these endless dusty shelves and riddled tombs for an eon of untimed age, caressing the stone-cold walls and treading my feet along its musky surface. No one to speak to share thoughts and odd emotions. Only yourself, the room and your mind, alone, for eternity. Why, yes. Sometimes I do. Looking after all these consumed bodies, surely it does grow old after a while, does it not? Septimus shrugged.
I do not know.
Shima fixed narrowing eyes at the keeper, trying to read his facial expression, albeit he had no nose, none to speak of. His face was as flat as a slipping river stone, and smooth as crystal. His pale skin bristled again from blue to orange to green. Then a lighter color. Was it, he dare say, pink? Shima continued to eye him, long red needle posted and posed in small hand, as if about to terribly penetrate the dire fabric. From all good terms, Septimus's strange and scary figure did not seem to frighten the girl, not one bit. Instead, she enjoyed his company as much as he was starting to enjoy hers. Really? Was this his feeling? A real feeling? Was it care? Septimus nudged his long arm, his white robes moving along his forearm. Shima continued.
You cannot fool me, Keeper of the Dead. I can see your white skin and how it flickers colour to your little old eyeballs. Are you sad?
Septimus flashed a quick smile for the second time today. His teeth were fanged, sharp, razored blackness, as black as oil, and they were crooked, turning to one side, the left of his mouth.
As I say afore, you are astute.
I know.
Yes.
How do souls leave their body?
Through light.
What kind of light?
She asked keenly, as they acted upon the stone table. A curious girl of the ways of this world.
It is my profession to ensure their travel is safe to the Yellow King. They pass into the system of the tomb, their soul seeking evident ethereal ascendance once they reach their station within the stars.
Do you believe in them? Where do they go?
Souls, you mean to ask?
Yes.
Septimus cleared his throat a few times, thinking hard. He had not been asked that question before, ever.
Well, they leave the tomb or become a part of its foundations. Like flesh, like bone, like mind. The soul departs, leaving an empty vessel to be discarded, and the soul journeys through the void. To a place,
Septimus shrugged, clasping his hands,
that I do not know.
Shima wrinkled her nose and looked down at the fabric, her eyes staring down at it, rubbing her fingers between the cold, thin steel of the needle. You do not know where it goes?
No.
Do you know where your soul will go when you die?
No.
That was a lie. He did know. Nowhere. What does Polis do? Septimus narrowed his black-wide eyes.
I told you of this. It is a city of the dead.
I know it's a city, you snaggermuff. What is its purpose? What does it do? Septimus sighed. Septimus took careful time to choose his words before he spoke.
It is a place of seeking. A place where the living come to take their last breath. A place where all order and chaos reign.
Now how does that make sense? She purred and girded her tan brow.
I do not know.
Then what is it?
A city.
Shima growled and rolled her shining eyes. You're no fun, Septimus, Keeper of the Dead. Septimus merely shrugged at that. Shima sighed, threading the needle. So you do not know how this place works, but you live here. How does that make sense? Septimus sighed again, rubbing his brow with 2 fingers.
As I say, Shima, it is a place of learning, but also of suffering and despair. An endless chasm, a ground unearthed with death. To know the consciousness from human souls and why they are like so, as it may be. To fly beyond the realm and showcasing the beauty of the mind. To become one, all another and everything in between. A precious place. It is said that Valaling of Corporate Villeton once roamed these lands, a masterful lord.
His eyes grew alight for the first time.
It was said, of course, that anything the Lord touched and laid his pale hand upon, it would be brought back to life, even deceased. It was as if the very palms had been woven from space heavens.
Shima listened closely, nodding along. She seemed a smart enough little girl anyhow, her eyes glowing in the dim and dreary stone room with wonder. She was the perfect audience, nodding along at the words, interjecting a word or two, maybe three, a question or phrase. That is why we come here, isn't it? To this desert from another planet. It is said to be a great honor to give your essence to the king. Septimus nodded a grim smile, plastering his large face and head.
That is very much so, little one. You have been chosen. I am certain your family is proud of you. Shima's mouth made a quirky line, tugging at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes watered a bit, as if trying to hold back faint tears of sadness. They were... Good. Septimus nodded. Where is it do you come from? Which galaxy or planet? Star or comet or void or moving ship?
Shima frowned deeper, the folds of her forehead creasing like rivulets of turned-over blankets. Earth.
Ah, I've heard of this place from my scrolls. They detail the history of the universe from the first birth to the most recent death in every planet. Is it pretty there?
Mm-hmm. Sunny and meadowy, sweet-smelling flowers, rivers and trees and fuzzy animals, wood houses and whole towns. There is even trade. You can get married and have children to any man you like. Foods and drinks, even hunting and fishing and crafts, painting, reading, sewing, meals with your family. And there is roads made of grass and gold. It's very colorful. Her brow deepened as if remembering a painful memory. And sometimes there is war. And money. Septimus nodded at this, listening along. He was a good listener. He had to be. If this girl's pure soul were to be transferred to that of Polis, it had to be a good one.
It sounds very peaceful.
Shima nodded. Did she miss her family? Was she alone and afraid of this new fleshy place that was about to consume her? If so, she did not show it. Septimus almost felt some sort of worry, no pity for her, but it shaded over his eyes like a shadowy veil. No, we need the soul, nothing else. The body will be disposed. It is. My Da used to tell me that this place called Polis is for wicked ones, where figures of white and in moonlight skin go to do the deeds of the dead, and that it is a place for torment. Septimus nearly laughed at that. It had been so long since he laughed. The girl did not see it, but the corner of his mouth dragged up a bit in suppression of his gurgling warming in his throat, and his eyes gleamed. Even his white belly rumbled a tad.
Wicked ones.
She nodded. It is true. This place is full of the damned.
If the soul is harnessed here, pleasured, it is given its right in the seat of holy gods.
Septimus disagreed. It had been a long time since he had a good argument. Shima shook her head. No, the soul might be harnessed, Septi. Septimus frowned at that again. But how do you control where it flows? Septimus felt his skin grow sickly red. Agitation. Who had ever questioned his duty and his station? This was his domain, his land, his kingdom. No one. He shook his head.
It flows to the Yellow King, through wires and tubes to his tower.
Where is his tower?
It is a large black stone one across the desert.
Does the king live there?
Yes.
What does he do?
I do not know.
Does he have a wife?
Yes.
Is she pretty? Septimus shivered at that.
I do not know.
Does he have advisors?
Yes.
Who are they?
Barons of the desert. Council.
It sounds lonely.
I believe it must be.
So you collect the souls from bodies. The body itself is not worthy or something? Septimus nodded, happy that the girl was catching on somewhat. He was still need to show her around the vicinity for the next 5 days before it was time for the transportation.
In this fetid world, little one, bodies are disposable. Whether it is a gender or pristine consumption. What's inside?
Septimus laid a hand over his belly, then traced it up to his heart.
Is the treasure.
Shima nodded. I get it. You prefer the insides. It is more whole.
Yes,
Is that how Polis works?
it is how the tomb of Polis functions.
Then who is God here? Is it a funny little ghost? She wiggled in her stone seat like an excited puppy. Septimus didn't know what a ghost was, so he ignored that, but he nodded to her first question.
Yes, there is a god.
Who is God here, Keeper?
The pilgrim.
Who is that?
A god.
You just said it was a god, so I know it was a god, Septimus, sir. But what is it?
He is of the sun.
Shima cocked her head, her curly brown hair swinging against her shoulders to look up to the dark purple sky and the twinkling stars at the blaring golden sun rising high into the sky of this vault. He lives in the sun?
Yes.
Does he control this place?
No. The Yellow King does. We worship him.
Do you believe he exists? Septimus blinked twice.
Why, yes, of course I do. What a strange question.
Shima shrugged. How do you know he exists if you've never seen him before?
We have murals.
He waved a long pale arm across the large stone room behind him, pointing to the previous dim hallway where etchings in the very rockwork depicted his elegance in a dashing red robe and a thinner skeleton frame, hands outstretched to grasp the physical sun between his fingers. So you believe he exists because of a mural?
Yes.
That's a load of posh.
He is the one true, the one almighty, the one eternal, the savior of our land.
Septimus, of course, did not know of a world without a god. Do you like buttons? I used to have a coat with loads of copper ones. Ruby ones too, wood ones too. My dad would go into the forest to chop the oaks into the bark and craft them with his bowl. It kept me...
Let us focus on the task at hand. No more talking.
The girl furrowed her brow and digested the information as she continued with her task. She was good with the needle, and continued, and threaded it through the Hessen sacking without issue. The thick yellow fabric was soft and plush like velvet, and the needle red as strawberries and sharp as a fang.
Can you tell me what these are for?
Septimus opened a palm to the row of bags lined up on the work table. Varying in size and length, they covered most of the table and would take hours more to complete. They are for moving the dead, said the girl indifferently. From their home to here.
And why are they important?
The curator lopped off the last strand and clipped the end of the thread off deftly with a small cutting blade. His bag complete, he placed the tools on the table and watched Shima finish hers. Once made holy,
Sanctified, yes.
well, when that's done, the bags are like a little piece of this place that can be carried anywhere. She stopped threading for a moment and met Septimus's eyes. Those bright blue orbs of hers shone unnaturally in the light of the underhive. It is what he wills.
Correct.
Septimus claps his hands together, the hint of a smile becoming more apparent. He had found that he was quite enjoying the conversation with the girl. Corpses, he'd found, were good listeners, a little else than a good talker.
Do you know the words of the Keeper?
Shima nodded, though she seemed more hesitant than before.
I would like to hear them, if you wouldn't mind.
The girl put down the needle and thread and placed her hands in her lap. She squeezed her eyes shut and for a moment and then began reciting the words of his vocation. From life's pale light, stark but true, to death's delight, a life that's due. In throes of the end where the sun cannot go, his garden we must tend, his seed we must sow. The words delivered, Shima picked up her tools and began to thread again.
That was well said.
Septimus opened his eyes, having closed them during the recital. The intense brightness of the workroom made him flinch, and he blinked back the light.
You learned the words during your trials, I take it.
He said once recovered. Yes, Keeper. The girl was squinting hard at the thin thread, scrupulous concentration on her young features. The questions had stopped by now. It was at the time for work, for duty. Septimus stared down at his own thin athletic needle and considered his words carefully before next he spoke.
How many of you were there?
He watched her from the corner of his eye, looking for a reaction, but she was stoic in her work. her head slumped over the material. 7, she said. 8, if you include me.
I do.
Said Septimus, pursing his lips.
Indeed, I would be remiss not to, given how things have turned out.
Shima beamed at him, her cheeks coloring, increasing as her smile revealed a perfect row of white teeth. Then she returned to her work, her face fixed in a tight-knit mask of focus. He couldn't imagine one as young as her competing in the trials, vying against others twice her age for the honor she had been rewarded. There must be a hidden strength within this girl, he concluded.
And of the others, what became?
The lights went out, plunging the workroom into darkness absolute. Septimus carefully stood up from his seat, his hands patting the table as he moved toward the entranceway.
Place the needle on the table and be still,
he said, turning where he thought Shima would be. The girl was deathly quiet, but he thought he heard the soft shift of her utensil being laid down.
This won't take a moment.
He hoped that were true, but the sporadic shutdowns were becoming more common, lasting longer. He walked away from the table, relinquishing his grip on the seat nearest, and stumbled to the doorway. His hands held out in front of him, feeling through the darkness, his skin moving in jets of olive green and a tinge of black, fear, rubbing his long fingers along the rough stone walls, his feet guiding him until he finally came into contact with the cold steel tiling of the wall. What can I do? Shima's voice came softly from beside him. He hadn't even heard her cross the floor.
I thought I told you to be still.
He wasn't annoyed, but she would have to learn to follow instructions. I'm scared, she said. I don't like it down here. It was almost a relief to hear her act her own age, however fleetingly, and Septimus felt around until he had her shoulder beneath his hand, gripping it tightly.
Do not be afraid, little one. It was just the lights,
he said, patting her in what he hoped was a reassuring manner.
I'll have this fixed momentarily.
She said nothing in reply, but he felt her shoulders relax beneath his grip.
Now if I could just find...
He felt around the wall, searching for the access console.
It should be... Found it.
Septimus let out a deep breath, flexed his fingers, and concentrated. The room was already getting colder, the rest of the systems having shut down with the lights. If he left it like this, they'd eventually freeze to death. The oxygen supply wasn't depleted before then. A crypt without a keeper, a tomb without its guardian. He shuddered at that thought, and then pressed his palm against the screen. It took a moment before he could feel it, a slight tingling sensation along the tips of his fingers. The feeling quickly moved across to his palm and then to his wrists. The words he recited were not of the common tongue, nor the archaic spiel commonly associated with this station. No, the words were far older than that. He created a link with the beating heart of the Polis and beseeched it. He showered it with adulation and made promises that would bind him even further to the tomb. But most importantly of all, he brought with him a gift. And the gift he brought was the only gift that Polis valued: life. This place functioned on human souls, their vitality, their juice, their heart. Without it, well, this place would quite simply fall to ruin. The incantation took longer this time, and he could feel his life energy leaving his body at an alarming rate. It wouldn't be long before a more precious energy, that of his soul, was siphoned off too. A bead of sweat ran down his brow, rolling down his forehead and past his lips. He was almost at the bottom of his reserves. He was about to concede defeat and take a step back to recoup his losses, but he left a soft hand pressed against his own. He looked down, but Shima was swathed in as much darkness as the rest of the room. Try again, she whispered, clasping his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and Septimus decided not to question the girl. He closed his eyes, forcing his will upon the heart of the Polis once more. A jolt of electrifying energy raced through him, bursting out from the small hand he held with such force that he gasped. His heart rate elevated and his eyes dilated. He began to sweat and shiver in the cold, airy room. Breaths and frosty breezes buffeted his robes. His long fingers began to get numb. There was so much power he could barely contain it. He remembered his duty before it could overwhelm him. and he began the incantation again. It didn't take long for the system to reboot, not once their combined energy had been used to kickstart it. The lights sputtered back on, as did the temperature control. In the distance, he thought he could hear the soft purr of the Polis. Deep down, beyond the twisted passageways and narrow archways, below the winding bridges that crisscrossed above, the heart of the place was pleased. Septimus remembered that first gaze upon entering Polis when he traveled there after the birth from the wall. It was a sickening, stricken thing. He could recall the tall, hard, grayish statues of the gods, the glowing red bellies of pregnant ladies bestowed in their gorgeous giddy form. Where he guided his bare feet along the cold, rising bridges and twisted, tiled glyphic sculptures, he would gaze upon its fine, coarse setting, where their malformed malice faces of redness, their noses interlocked, their black eyes all seeing and wet, their skulls scraped and ashy, their tendons wrapped together, as if the very facades had been melted into the very walls. Bulging-breasted women, naked holographic beings concealed within tombs, and horned queens with glassy masks perched upon their stone pedestals to stare out over Polis like silent spires. The running theme throughout Polis's murals and reliefs is one of loss of control. Skeletal hands grasp at other heads as if to take control, while some characters battle against tubing that's consumed their faces. What is inside? Not on the outside. Fleshy, sexy, almost lifelike etchings race across the walls of this place. A primordial painting of a man, tangled inside the bent-over stone. His penis is strapped to a drooping, but erect sword as a naked woman with her pearly buttocks exposed to the world, cradling and licking his nethered, snowy member. Other positions displayed fiery fuckery, of thick thighs pressed against faces, tongues lopping out of their horrible black mouths like a thick fog to suckle the nipple of a cupping hand, or even yet, bright murals of riding astride bony steeds. Of course, he cannot forget his movement up beyond the clouds. The pilgrimage towards holy light past curving pillars and explicit statues feels like walking through a twisted church nave. A patchwork of purple webs, silvery, sticky, and warm, and long and stringy, millions of them, all attached to the very beings of this place, darting in various directions across the tight ceilings, where the hot air brushes your skin and pushes your back. Squishy, deflated brains are formed here to reach a higher hierarchy. His brain hurt to think on it. It even made behind his eyes ache. It was a painful process, too painful to recount, but it still stayed suckered into his mind like a curtain refusing to peel back the edges. It was where he was assigned to his post, a duty, a profession, something to achieve, something to do. Without, he was lost, stumbling through the fields of sands with no purpose, no final point. He could smell it too, the damp, devilish place. The smell of iodine and meat and raw blood and body heat and death and murky stone. It was a smelly thing. A hard, flowing, awful thing, like sticking your nose into a warm pool of growing, dilapidated sores filled with pus. Unformed. Noxious. He remembered the cold stone under his feet as he walked, the feeling of the roughness against his fingers, to go join the bodies that were being directed and dissected to be one of them. He was strapped to a sapphire contraption with 6 shackles of iron and 6 rings around his ankles. The Queen, surveyor of the soul, marker of charts, reader of history, gore puncher, ruler alongside the Yellow King, his wife, his heir, his lover, a wicked woman of deceit. With yellow arms of 8, bladed and sharp, a domed cranium, closed wide eyes, and a wider split smile up to her temples, she cut into him. He could still feel the sting of her knife. Saws grinding, bones crushing, blood spilling. It was as if his last breath had escaped from his throat. His belly ripped open to show his shining guts that hung to his legs, his skull sliced in to remove his brain, to have it soar up into the pinkish spidery webs of gods for examination. To see if he was the right man for the job, his penis sucked within a long-nosed vessel. Once done and inspected, his bones were sinewed and splinted, his intestines put back in his belly, and his skull screwed back on with his brain intact. And he was ready. The pain was blinding. It was so real and alive, he felt every stab, every prick, every burn from it. Even in that moment, tied like a wounded hound to the bolts of the chair, the only pain he could remember was the sight of it all, happening before him. Over the next 5 days, Septimus brought Shima with him and showed her all the different areas in Polis, taught her what usage it was for and why it was so. The deeper they traveled, the more gruesome it seemed to get, although the little girl did not seem bothered by the slightest of this visceral world. He took her across the plains of paints, Aviuk paints, first depicting an obese victim of war riddled with bullet holes, the top of its head shorn off, leaving brain matter and fluid to freely slide outwards. In subsequent images, there are innards fully liquefied and then drain off, as its shell first mottles and then begins to flake away in patches. At a glance, it looks less like a body than it does a ravaged building, striations of hardened skin giving it the appearance of rebar torn off its surrounding masonry. When heaped into mounds, it can sometimes be hard to pinpoint individual forms, such as the annihilation and putrefaction death take on the appearance of a singular entity, certainly not necessarily one you'd associate with having ever lived. So he explained many things to her, in the simplest terms possible that he could think of. With her hand grasping the inside of his long fingers, refusing to let go, he guided her. On that first day, he spoke of the floating lamps, how they are lighted by the energy of a soul gives the tomb, that they work as a sort of hive, flying, swaying, transcribing, and tallying the lists of the dead bodies through their shimmering glitter, sending waves of shocks and messages to Septimus's mind to alert if any unseen presence had boarded the tomb. That was how he knew if Shima's figure once entered. The lamps had told him before they had met face to face. He took her to the mechanism, the organic nexus. The room's walls are alive with a lattice of glistening sinewy tendrils, their undulating motions synchronized with the hum of arcane machinery. The air is thick with a palatable energy, charged with the essence of the cosmic unknown. The room was bathed in an eerie glow, emanating from bioluminescent fungi that sprout from the crevices, casting a mosaic. The ceiling was a canvas of shifting constellations, a living tapestry of swirling nebulae that pulsate with a rhythm of strange origin that Shima did not know. So he explained this was the workshop, a place not only for learning, but development. At the center of this magic space stood a sprawling workbench, its surface a mosaic of interlocking bone and metal melded seamlessly. On the workbench, tools rest, delicate appendages crafted from the bones of ancient cosmic beasts, humming with the latent power of eons. Glass jars, each containing a unique specimen, line the walls like curious witnesses to an intergalactic experiment. Within, creatures of disparate origins rest in suspended animation, their forms ranging from aquatic beings with bright chipped fins to sentient crystalline entities, their multi-faced, gleaming in the soft light. One jar held a luminescent orb, radiating a soothing azure light. This orb is a symbolic life form, its translucent tendrils intertwining with an intricate lattice of metal gears. Another jar encased a magnificent avian creature, its wings gemming with feathers interwoven with filaments that catch and reflect the ambient light. Nestled amidst the jars, a pulsing organ of undulating flesh and circuits beats with an eerie harmony, the very heart of this workshop. It pulses in time with the celestial rhythms of the universe, its cadence resonating with the life essence of the creatures in the jars. It was the place of making, of crafting. During these days, she was a bright pupil, skipping along Septimus in steady jumps, more and more questions arising from her plump lips. He found her to be rightly enjoyable, and found even greater comfort in her words. He answered them best he could, noticing that his skin was slipping to a more light green than anything else when they were together. Joy, happiness, pleasure, the flavorful company of someone else. He taught her of her duties before her travels to the great silent Yellow King, the long history of such a place, which was unusual, incomplete, and spacey. She never spoke of home much, just that she had 2 older brothers and a younger sister, some type of odd furry pet named Mia, and her parents were traders. She never stated the year of Earth, or the location, or the name of the city where she came from, and Septimus didn't ask. He simply did not think like that. He spoke of frightening creatures that used to roam these halls before his time, which was imprecise. Moldmen, homunculi, white weathered beings that clung to the surface and crawled in the hallway spaces between. Monstrous flesh-formed reptiles that sat in dark chambers and feasted on the dire needs of supplements. These creatures had long been extinct for 1,000 years or more, wiped out to devastation by the Great War that riveted the very cosmos of this place. And it did frighten the little girl, but not Septimus. Not as much as the wall. She followed him around every corner and corridor, but soon the questions began to dither, the happy excitement began to fade, the charming wit slowed, until she was nothing more than a dutiful specimen. Septimus flexed his tired fingers and clenched his hands as icy water ran over them. He rubbed his palms against his cheeks, letting the water splash against his face and neck, and flinched as a chill ran through him. Next, he patted down his skin with a small towel, paying special attention to his throat and his neck. Then Septimus applied the grease paints. He was less scrupulous with his application than normal, knowing the mask he would soon don, and the paint was smeared on the unevenly in places. From the gray bowls adjacent to the basin, he retrieved a darker blend of fine ochre and grease. He applied the black paint beneath his eyes, stroking a finger gently against his skin as he layered it on. The grease paint stung when he'd been careless, and his eyes started to water. He rubbed at them gently with the back of his hand, and then shook his head, staring down into the water of the basin. The image that met him was hardly recognizable. He was so old, it was like the number of age was foreign. Gray tufts of hair jutted out above his ears, while the rest of his head was a barren place, empty of hair, and covered with liver spots. Folds of skin, lathered in powder, hung from his neck and cheeks. The whites of his eyes glowed visibly against the contrasting paints that he applied, making him look even wilder than normal. How many times had he done this? How many times had he completed this never-ending task? Septimus bent over to retrieve the robes by his feet, feeling the tension in his back and legs as he did so. With a deep sigh, he smoothed down the sleeves and tightened the thin belt across his waist. The belt was growing tighter each time. It wouldn't be long before he'd have to pierce another hole in it. The mask he picked up from the table beside him was old and heavy. Wrought from burnished steel and gold, the thing was expertly carved. Set in an expression of neutrality, the face that Septimus drew over his own was that of a young man in the prime of his life. Complete with accompanying curls and light dimples beneath the cheeks, the artistry of the mask was beyond reproach. Intricate shapes had been woven into the golden face, and lavish forms wrapped themselves around each other in a ceaseless dance that covered every inch of the mask. The dance was one of life and death, of duality, a celebration of coexistence, for without one you cannot have the other. The last embellishment added, Septimus was now ready to perform his duty. Darkness crept through the corridors, trailing behind the flittering lanterns that tracked their route. Dense rows of shelves lined the walls, but were mainly empty. Covered in dust, their contents had been added to the already vast number of tomes, waiting to be digitized for posterity. Septimus saw a few less sparsely furnished sills as they wandered deeper into the library, but he ignored them. He would get to those in due course.
Come, child,
He said, locking arms with Shima.
the way is close. We are nearly there.
The girl nodded beside him, content to let him guide her through the passages. She was becoming more familiar with the layout of the Polis, but one could never quite know such a place, not completely. As they closed on their destination, the lanterns raced ahead of them, ducking narrowly beneath the great archway at the end of the walkway. Then they hovered, casting the luminescent against the walls of a small room some distance away. They seemed more animated than usual, visibly buzzing with excitement. They were deeper in the Polis than he had been for an age, than he had ever been. The air was different here, heavier, more prone to deep silence. The whir of mechanisms and the deep hum of the tomb iron engines, something he took for granted, had faded, and then disappeared entirely. Within these canine tunnels that thinly disguised as corridors, time flitted by inquisentially. With each step, it seemed to slow further, dragging him with it. When they reached the room, Septimus could feel hot sweat running down his forehead, mixing with the ochre and grease paint that covered his face. The concoction of bodily fluids and oils stung his skin and made his eyes water more than before, further aggravating the problem. The mask of the Keeper was making him even more uncomfortable with each passing moment, but he couldn't remove it, not until this final task was complete. He squinted through the eye holes, blinking back the burning sensation until he became numb to it.
What do you know of this place?
Septimus unwound his arm from Shima's and stepped into the center of the room. The girl hesitated for a moment, and then followed him, twisting her neck to stare about as she did so. Tangles of wires hung from corners above, clinging to the walls like knotted webs. A red light blinked along the cables, moving from one side of the room to the other, and then repeating the circuit. Beneath the cords, thick panels of black steel had been bent into shape and forced together. They formed separate rows, tiers of steps that spanned up to the shadowed ceiling of the cell. Upon each of these steps, black mirrored screens rested, waiting to be activated and put to use. Shima gazed about her soft breathing the only sound in the room. I haven't seen it before. She frowned, her brow knitted in concentration. It was not in my lessons. Where are we? Septimus was silent as he moved toward the steps, red light blinking as it completed yet another trip. The lamps had calmed and now hovered silently above their heads, barely moving as they tracked their master's movements.
We are in the heart of the Polis,
said Septimus finally. He swiped a hand against the nearest screen and began to chant beneath his breath. These were the old words again, the kind that hang in the air long after they've been voiced, the kind that spoke to the spirit of the place, to its very soul. He felt his heart rate increase as he uttered them, and the screen go warm beneath his hand. As he watched, a handle emerged from the molded black steel beside him, seeming to come out from nothing. Such was the perfection of the cut lines and the step itself. Septimus pulled at the handle gently, coaxing it out with more words, and then with more force until it responded. A simple drawer materialized from behind the handle and hung out over the step like an uneven tooth, ready to be pulled. The box contained therein was less simple. Dozens of silver tubes ran across the surface of the thing, so dense and tightly wrapped in white cloth and twine, it seemed impossible to differentiate between them. 2 rows of sockets ran down the one side, culminating in a nest of wired springs and inputs. A simple opaque window sat between them and stared back up at the keeper. "It's time then." Shima's voice was soft, and the heavy air of the place threatened to smother her words.
"It is time,"
Septimus agreed. He was somber as he input his code into an ancient screen beside the panel, resulting in a hiss emanating from the drawer itself, followed by a wisp of hot steam that burned their faces a little. The lid of the box began to rise, hesitantly at first until it flopped open entirely, revealing the space within. Septimus said nothing as he bent down over the open box and retrieved a little bundle of rags from within. He was quiet as he walked across the room, stopping only to wave the hovering lamps away, and stepped outside. There was a clink as whatever was contained within those rags bounced against one another on the floor, and then there was silence. Septimus returned, his expression hidden behind the impassive mask he wore, but his eyes flickered for a moment, moving from Shima to the drawer before settling on her face.
"Did you recite the words when you awoke?"
He asked. His hands were clasped before him, his shoulders hunched. "Yes, Keeper," she said almost weakly. Her happy demeanor when they had met nearly 5 days ago had faded, replaced by the sheer vanity of duty, as if she were not merely a 6-year-old child.
"Did you pack away your tools?"
"Yes, Keeper." Septimus nodded, his lips pursed behind the mask. It was the grease paints that irritated his eyes, that made them water. He let out a yielding sigh and turned to open the shell. Thinner wires ran along the inside, flowering across the small seat, positioned inside like numberless veins. A dim light pulsed through them, a glowing pink that throbbed intermittently. Septimus brushed a hand across the small seat, wiping his paint-stained fingers against the smooth material. It was rough beneath his hand, and he could feel a hint of moisture, residue from its previous occupant. He rubbed his fingers together, feeling the fine grains of bone and cloth between them.
"Then you know your duty,"
he said, looking to the girl. "He wills it." Shima's voice was even, devoid of any hint of hesitation or nervousness. She stepped toward the shell, her gray robes clutched between her hands to stop them getting in the way. He hadn't even got around to hemming them in. No matter, he thought as she approached. The time for that has passed. She extended a hand and Septimus accepted it, helping her up over the top of the drawer. She clambered over the sill and onto the seat within, arching her back and wiggling down until she was comfortable. The keeper squeezed her shoulder gently and then pressed his hand against the screen beside the chamber. The lid clicked, and then jolted at its activation, whining softly as it began to close. Septimus could still see the girl's face and watched through the panel as the lid tightened over her. She was whispering the words to herself, her eyes squeezed shut as the sarcophagus was sealed. The light that ran through the dense wiring within the shell began to throb brighter and more persistently. The pink glow turned a shade of red and then green as the lid was finally shut. Septimus was forced to look away as the beam grew in intensity, until it was like staring at the sun. The entire room turned a sickly, blaring green, and even the flashing red light was blotted out from view. Septimus placed a hand upon the shell, flinching at the heat that coursed upon its surface. The tubes that surrounded the cylinder were beginning to glow themselves, pumped full with neurotic energy that quickly spread to the wires on the floor and walls. From here it would make its way across the rest of the Polis, coursing through the veins of the ship, reinvigorating the heart of the place. There was enough energy to sustain the tomb for an age, perhaps forever. As the blazing light began to fade, Septimus opened his eyes and stared down at the sarcophagus. He still couldn't look through the panel. Such was the force of the energy that emanated from within. Instead, he confronted himself with the thought that the little girl was content, that Shima was pleased to take her rightful place within the tomb. It was such a duty for one so young. Regardless, to be interred within the vessel for all eternity, like so many others before her, was a great honor, perhaps the greatest. Septimus smiled to himself, and then stepped away from the glowing sarcophagus. He had many duties to fulfill that day, and the next. A simple routine, yes, that's it. A satisfying time. He clicked his back and rolled his shoulders. His old bones were starting to feel better already. But something inside him changed. Something snapped, something moved in his thumping heart. He turned around, seeing through the glassy screen just a caring, loving little girl upon the leather seat. Eyes shut, nose crunched, lips closed, worry and fear all over her face. Jesus, she was just a child, by God. She was a little girl. What was he doing? He looked around at all the nests and vents where he had laid to rest previous souls and bodies before. Why was now so different? What was he feeling? Pity? It was like the barrier in his mind had been twisted in a circle, and then again once more. An unusual vibrance within his bones. His pale skin shifted within all the colors it could muster. A new color was coming on. What was it? Gold? Gold, it was gold. Pity, care, love. He flicked his wide eyes to the heated tomb, burning brighter, ever brighter still. It must be boring to be alone forever, looking after the bodies. What was happening to him? He never swayed his actions just because a simple question from a little girl had changed his thinking. It was preposterous. He was the curator, the keeper, the tomb watcher, soul seeker of the dead, passing them on to their next journey. But something about that little girl stayed his mind and hand. No one will remember you, alone forever. He had done this task 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times over. It's what stopped him now from doing his duty today. By God, by God, by God. She was just a little girl. She was only 6. With warm eyes and beautiful hair, a sweet, endearing face, and an even sweeter voice. She knew what would become of her. A passage to the Yellow King would suffice his everlasting rule, to feed the mouths of ecstasy. But what was one soul worth the price of many? Is this selfish of him to think this way? Could he spare her this horrible fate? She was so young. This was not him. He felt lost. He felt scared for the first time, unsure of what he was doing anymore, or what his profession required of him. With a strike of panic, he raced over to the heated box and tugged frantically on the handle. He gripped and strained, yelled and coughed and spat and spluttered with all his might and strength, pulled it square open, nearly stumbling back from its impact. He caught himself on those long legs of his. Inside, but only her hair slightly singed, her tan skin a little sooted and burnt, but it appeared to not have any markings or scars across her, and smelling of ash was Shima shy, her eyes narrowed, confused at the new blinding light entering her pupils. She looked up at Septimus, his face contorted in an emotion of agony and pity, his pale skin pulsing and pulling. Keeper, what? Before she could say another word, Septimus scooped her up into both his arms and pressed her shining head to his beady roped chest. What was he doing? Surely this was madness. The Silent King would have his head. All the advisors would surely have his spine. His soul would be doomed, even his hands. They'd take his hands too. But he could not sit here anymore and watch grand young lives be damned for his sake, as he sat back and did nothing. He did not know if it was a change of heart. He did not know whether it was standing there watching the girl's soul about to tear from her body. He did not know if it was because she was so young or so full of life, or so cherishable or so sweet. He did not know if it was her question. He did not know if he simply was tired of what he was doing for thousands of years. But he wanted to be remembered, not just in death but in life. What beauty lay in existence of the keeper of the dead? Nothing, he knew. He could not sit no longer and watch their fates be decided while he was a pawn in a bigger play. So cupping her inside his robes, her body began to shiver from the new warmth of his lanky stomach. His hands tangled in the kindness of her brown hair that smelled of honey. He ducked his head, wrapped his arms around her, stroking her cheek, tears spilling out of his eyes. Real tears, hearty tears, salty tears. They ran in large dollops upon his face and cheeks that pitter-patter across the girl's nose and forehead. She coughed, her nimble small hands clutching at the hems of his robes. So he began to run, taking big leaping long strides across the floor. Could he board a bay pod and fly out of this place? What would he do? Where would he go? Could the silent king peer his every move? But he did not care. So he ran and he ran and he ran, across that black-walled coffin like a grazing quick cat, the girl bobbing in his hands tucked beneath him. He did not know where he was going, how or when or who. He didn't even know how he would get off this wasteland. But he knew no matter what, he had to keep that little girl safe. And in Septimus's mind, that was worth all the gold any king could offer him.
Goodbye, baby, in the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will rock. And there will be I will fall.
Went to hell, I met some friends. You know it's not that bad. Cocktails and cigarettes for sins I don't regret. But someone thought it best to raise me from the dead. So let's put on a show. I hit more demon mode. Bow down and pray that I don't take your soul. You'll never see me coming tucked under the bed. I'll creep inside your head and never let you go. I hit my demon mode. Sticks and stones, I'll break your bones if you call out my name. Pentagrams and crooked laughs, a curse you can't explain. Pick up my feet, let the fun begin. Call out the minions and the skeletons. Join us or pay the price. Eternal sacrifice. You're running out of time, and soon you'll be all mine. I'll never let you go. I hit more demons.